Eitan Hersh, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So listen, what I've learned all of my life is that it's good for people to be politically engaged. We want a politically active citizenry. We want people to care about politics. You don't completely disagree with that, but you worry that too many Americans and perhaps too many people in other democracies have become political hobbyists, that they care about politics in the wrong ways and perhaps too much in certain respects. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I think that the way that 95% of people who are engaged in politics are engaged is not really politics. It's like really it's like, it's like if we imagine that all football fans were actually football players and pretended that they were. They're not. Of about a third of the country that pays attention to politics, nearly all of them are just engaging for sort of emotional connection or for intellectual gratification. They want to learn stuff. And they're not building the right skills or getting the right knowledge for them to inform votes or activism. So they're just doing a totally different thing.
So tell me what sort of a good amount of political engagement would look like, or a good form of political engagement, right? I mean, one of my favorite essays to teach is by Benjamin Constant, The Liberty of the Ancients Compared to That of the Moderns, right? And he makes sort of 2 points, right? The first is that there was a kind of pleasure in doing politics that was available to you in ancient Athens, which is not going to be available to you under modern circumstances, because there's too many of us, we're too busy, there's too many distractions, there's too many fun other things to do in life. So we're just not going to be spending half of our day sitting around the assembly and actually, deciding whether to go to war, who to banish from the city, what kind of musical instruments should be allowed, and all the kinds of things that ancient Athenians, or people more broadly in the ancient Greek world did, right? But Constant still said, so what we're going to do is to delegate a lot of our political decision making. You vote for representatives, they're your servants, they go off to Washington, they do the stuff for you, right? But you still got to be alert, you still got to be active, because there's a principal agent problem. In the same way in which in a corporation, you got to make sure as a shareholder that the CEO isn't just trying to line their own pockets. As a citizen, you got to make sure that the people who you empower are actually serving your interests rather than serving their own interests, or perhaps taking away your right to engage in politics. And so I think that's sort of set the way we tend to think about politics. Well, sure, you don't want to, part of the liberty of that we have in a representative democracy is that you don't have to know exactly what we're debating in Congress today. You don't have to go and do all this politics yourself. But we need this active citizenry, and the danger is that we don't have this active citizenry, that our politicians are going to go and run away with it, right? So what does it mean that we're sort of like pretending to do politics when we shouldn't? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you take a typical person who thinks they're very, very engaged and they spend 2 hours a day on podcasts and reading the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, whatever, and you ask them, okay, like, well, tell me what's going on in the state legislature, city council. They're like, I have no idea, right? We have like 15% turnout rates in local elections. We have almost no reporters showing up at, forget the local, not even at the state house in most places. And so the people who are spending 2 hours a day on politics are not doing that basic duty that you are imagining. They're paying attention to like gossip and BS, basically. And so I think that politics, like the way you described it in the ancient times, can be fabulously interesting and compelling. Let's think about what it is. When I think about politics, I think about an act that you're doing that's strategic, that's goal-oriented to try to influence the government, right? So you have some goal, like a policy goal, or maybe you just want like things run well, and you have some strategy, whether that's policy advocacy, getting the right people elected, government oversight. That's what you're doing. And there are people, of course, all over the country who do that form of politics. I find it very interesting to do it. I mean, I like to think that I do it. I follow what's going on in my community. I follow what's going on in my state. I get the local paper here. Like that's a version of political activism that has a very, very clear relationship to the kinds of outcomes you're talking about. I need to know what's going on in the legislature. Now, what happens at the national level? Obviously, we are a big country, so we do defer to organizations to do oversight. We do defer to the media to do oversight. But when it comes down to it, the typical person engaging in, say, like news consumption, uh, is really like engaging in the nastiest form of news consumption. They're just sort of like following the gossip, and there's not a very clear relationship, as I described at the state and local level, between, say, news consumption and the ability to be an active citizen.
So is the fear here that, ideally you would actually understand what the stakes of policies are? You're trying to advance policies that either serve your interest or perhaps in a more idealistic version align with your values. And instead you're kind of just like dunking on the other side, right? You're just spending time, whether it's on Twitter or watching cable news or listening to podcasts, with people just saying our side is great and the other side is terrible. And that gives you a kind of emotional high. In the same way that if you're a sports fan, it's fun to trash talk the other team when they just lost, or when they, one of the good players is, injured or moving to another team. Is it the idea that we're just engaging in it for emotional gratification, and is this sort of connected to polarization and particularly sort of, hatred of the other side of politics?
Yeah, yeah. So by the way, it's not just the emotional stuff. Some of it's just like this weird intellectual exercise. I have little kids who are now like diehard sports fans, and they bring up these statistics that they learn from the newspaper that, oh, the Boston Red Sox are really good on Sunday day games. They've won more Sunday day. And you're like, this is not a useful statistic for any.
Sorry to interrupt you. This has always bugged me so much. I don't watch American sports that much. I still, believe in real soccer, but
Yeah.
real football, I should say.
Yeah.
But whenever my cousin is into baseball, and he's like, on second Tuesdays in May, when the weather was below 65 degrees and Capricorn was in the ascendant, the Yankees won 3 out of 4 games. I mean, you have more statistical training than I do, but that just strikes me as utterly absurd as a way
Yeah.
of trying to predict what's going to happen.
Right. And I see a lot of that, very, very similar patterns in politics. I mean, I think a lot of this intrigue around the Supreme Court right now has this flavor. There's just a lot that's like that. But here's the question you asked is like, is this bad, basically? Who cares? Does it lead to polarization? And I think there's 2 reasons why we should think it's bad, right? One is that it affects the incentives of political actors. So if we are going to behave as citizens, like we're going to sit at home and we're going to watch viral videos pop up on social media, and whenever the most like viral, exciting video comes up, we're going to donate to the candidate who's like screaming, then you're going to get political actors who know how to play that game. And they do play the game, and it's obvious they play the game. And so, like, the kinds of people, for example, who are very good in politics at generating small dollar donations, and if you just go look at the top recipients of small dollar donations, it's like Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Bernie Sanders and AOC. These are the candidates that most of their money comes from small dollar donations. Now, why is that? Is it because of all these thoughtful, strategic actors? No, it's because they know how to make viral videos. And so I think the incentives are just totally screwed up when we do this kind of political hobbyism. The other big problem, and I think we see it all the time whenever the hobbyists try to show up in real life for the first time. Here's what happens. You've learned all of the wrong skills as a political hobbyist for politics. You've learned how to sort of emote and express yourself and get your point across and feel good. And then when you go do real politics, you realize, oh, shoot, the goal here is to get other people to agree with me and to build some kind of majority coalition. And so, it's sort of like, I give this an example, like when are we engaged in strategic behavior? If you're someone who needs to convince your boss to give you a raise, you go talk to your boss, and what is that conversation like? You think ahead of time. How do I get the boss to understand my position? How do I get them to see it my way? What do I have to do to see things his way or her way? And all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, I'm in a moment of strategy here. And in politics, in real politics, that's what it's like too, because you've got to build that coalition. In hobbyism, you're practicing this crazy alternative skill set. And so that's why you see sometimes when like a bunch of people descend on a school board meeting or show up on a campus protest and just say insane things that are super provocative because they've learned the totally wrong skill set for this.
So let me make a distinction between two different kinds of politics and try to tease out whether one of these is clearly superior to the other, right? So one is, you just consume politics, in social media, or perhaps every now and again you go and join a protest when there's a bunch of people out and you feel good about yourself shouting provocative slogans and feel like I'm really standing up for stuff, right? And that's what I take it you would call political hobbyism, right? It's sort of politics as moral gratification of some sort, rather than sort of strategically trying to actually influence what happens in terms of policy and regulation and other things governing our lives, right? Now, on the other side, let's say we have people who are quite strategic in how they go about things. They really figure out where the power lies. They try and pressure people and build coalitions and do what it takes in order to implement what they want, right? And I take it that you think that is, generally speaking, more positive because you're actually, affecting political change in some kind of way. I guess I that's a useful conceptual distinction. I might think that there's some helpful people in the first camp, which is, for example, to have some sense of collective decency in the polity, where when something happens that is just upsetting to a huge number of people, you suddenly get mass protests, you suddenly get people standing up against what's happening, and that seems to be an important mechanism in impeding authoritarian takeover, for example, when we're seeing what happened, not in the state of Georgia, but in the country of Georgia recently, right? There was an attempt to pass a foreign agents law that's similar to what Russia passed a number of years ago. It's part of an attempt to increase Russia's influence over the country. And, a bunch of people who are not that sophisticated about politics, who don't, always show up to the local city council, all came out in the streets for the first time because they're like, hang on a second, there's something going on here that is bothering us, that is bad. And that can actually be collectively quite effective in trying to stand up for our basic rights. That's sort of what I had in mind when I invoked Constant earlier, who said, look, most of the time it's fine to let our representatives do stuff, but sometimes we need to be able to tune in. And presumably that's partially when it feels like they're breaking the contract, no longer doing our bidding, but they want to become our masters, and then we need to be able to stand up. And that feels like political hobbyism might actually help to drive that kind of moment, right? Now, on the other side, I see that in general, it seems, much more sensible, much more sympathetic to imagine the person who actually knows how the local city council works, and they go there to actually get stuff done, right? But who are those people? I mean, some of those people are just people who are serving their own material interests, right? So it might be either real estate developers who are really good at actually understanding how to get stuff passed through their local town council because that's their job, or it might be NIMBY groups who are really effective at using every mechanism of a local polity to stop any housing from being built, and who might help to be responsible for the housing shortage we have at the national level, right? Or it might be these, very well organized activist groups who know how to pressure the local city council to make sure that when you go to the supermarket, every plastic bag now costs 5 cents. But that in itself can be a really ineffective way to pursue broader goals, right? Because I actually think when it comes to the environment, making sure that every plastic bag costs 10 cents, and so people have to carry around with stupid bags to the supermarket, is probably a lot less effective in doing something for the environment than a carbon tax or something much more broad and systemic. But that's the kind of thing that you as an ordinary citizen might be able to get through. If you live in a smallish town, somehow putting together the coalition through the right actions to impose that, 10-cent charge on the plastic bag, that's something you can get done. And then you're going to feel like you're actually politically effective. But that might all be distracting from what it would actually take to fix the real problems in the world. So I guess, yeah.
Let me offer some clarifications, because what you just described is sort of like an insider kind of politics versus an outsider form of politics, and I think you kind of attributed political hobbyism to the outsider form of politics and not to the insider. Actually, that's not how I would think of it. That is, there can be very strategic protest movements, and there can also be very dumb very dumb insider strategies. The outsider strategy can be totally effective. And even if the ordinary citizen who is engaging in a protest movement doesn't understand the strategy, it could be that the people who are organizing a protest do understand the strategy. When I think of examples like the Black Lives Matter movement turning into very concrete police reform in some states and cities, that was an outsider kind of popular form of engagement, protest movements that in many states did move policy very, very quickly. I guess in support of what the activists wanted. And so I think another example of that from the Trump era was when there was this the so-called Muslim ban, which then led to a lot of people essentially gumming up airports and physically gumming up airports and saying, we're not going to let the airport be functional basically until you. Now, those are very kind of strategic, narrowly goal-oriented protest movements, police reform, the Muslim ban, and so forth. But that kind of activist strategy is not for everything, and most normal politics is not going to look like that. And so the distinction for me is not sort of like protest versus insider politics. It's whether you're doing any kind of politics with any kind of strategy at all. So, I mean, if I take something like some of your listeners might remember the protest movement of Occupy Wall Street, where like if it was very hard to figure out what anyone wanted. There was no the governance of these Occupy movements was like a bunch of people hanging out in tents trying to reach consensus before they would do anything. And if you asked them what they wanted, like it wasn't clear. Now, it doesn't mean, even in a situation like that, that the activists didn't grow as citizens. I mean, they met one another, they talked to each other. Same thing for the Tea Party or the resistance movements. You can always sort of see like there's some growth potential or personal development that comes. But I think if you contrast something like the Occupy movement with a movement for police reform, what distinguishes them is like one was goal-oriented and specific, and one was just sort of like a mess of who knows what.
This is a complete side note, but reflecting back on the Occupy Wall Street movement, the sensible critique of it and the natural critique of it was that it lacked any form of internal hierarchy that could have aligned on concrete policy goals, and therefore, as you're trying to say, it kind of was this form of prolonged public performance art that didn't have any sort of particularly concrete impact. So it did change the conversation quite a lot. I mean, in indirect ways, I think Occupy Wall Street was quite an important moment, and it's probably hard to imagine Bernie Sanders's success in the 2016 primaries without something like the precursor of Occupy Wall Street. I'm thinking about how Occupy Wall Street as a movement contrasts with some of the protest movements we've seen in the last years, including both Black Lives Matter, but also some of the campus protests over the course of the last year. And, Occupy had this very strong preoccupation with the way we organize ourselves now is, in some sense, the way that society is going to be organized after the revolution, right? If we have this hierarchical vanguard party style of organizing and you manage to carry out a revolution, well, then you end up with a Soviet Union, and that's not great. And so there's something, I think, attractively self-reflective about that element of a movement, even though it probably led to some of its pathologies. And I just find it fascinating to what extent the relative idealism that pervaded the left, when we were both in grad school together, you're a few years ahead of me at Harvard, to the sort of strange, self-conscious pride in political cynicism and realism that has taken over the whole of the American polity, I think, but particularly the left now. One of the things that reporters were struck by in some of these college protests over the course of the last year is the consistency with which people said, I'm not authorized to speak to you because you're from the media, and we have a hierarchical organization, and there's a leader, and that leader is going to speak to us. Even in negotiations with college officials and others, this has been reported in a number of newspapers, just protesters just even if five of them show up, they say, no, this is our spokesperson. The other four people are just silent, right? There's something, there's something strange about that development that makes me, a little bit nostalgic for the broader background assumptions that drove Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, look, I don't know. I've interviewed some of the Occupy Wall Street people in the last few years, and I was struck by how they talked about the movement nostalgically because it created friendships and lessons about exactly like you're saying, how they want to be leaders. And, a lot of those people are like running as democratic socialists for local offices. So, they developed a network and a way of doing politics. And I suspect the same kind of thing is actually going to happen from these student movements now, where there's like so much internal bonding happening among these core group of activists. They have a lot of camaraderie around their values. Now, whether they'll be as effective, more effective, less effective, I don't know. But it's there is something obviously like these kind of very intense, highly scrutinized protest movements are affect the development of the activists themselves in profound ways.
Let me go to a topic that I think in a sense is related, for it's a little bit different. I'm always struck by the American debate over voter ID laws in particular. For two reasons. One is that the democracies I'm used to in continental Europe all require some form of voter ID, and the United States in most places and circumstances does not.
Yeah.
And then the second is that, there is this sort of background assumption in American politics that voter ID laws, requiring voter ID in order to be able to vote, would really harm Democrats and help Republicans. And the theory here is supposed to be that Democratic voters are on average poorer and that many of them don't have a form of ID. Now, I always had sort of two responses to that. The first of which is normative, and the second of which is empirical. The normative one is, if it really is true, as these arguments imply, that there's just millions of black voters who don't have any form of ID, the biggest problem isn't that they're not able to vote in the presidential election. The biggest problem is that they don't have a damn form of ID that allows them to use banks and identify themselves in all kinds of contexts in which it would be very helpful to their life to be able to do so. And so presumably the fix, and I know it's always hard to know what the fix is in a pretty broken system, is to make sure that they have access to free high quality ID rather than to say, let's not require that for the vote. But the empirical point was that I was always a little bit skeptical. There was just a hunch. I didn't really know that to be the case, that these kind of laws have quite a political effect that both Democrats and Republicans seemed to think they did, because Democrats would strenuously oppose any of those voter ID laws and Republicans would strenuously try to put them in place, in part because they both were convinced that it would be in their partisan interest to take those respective actions. Now, you have a paper with Justin Grimmer that puts a lot of cold water over that empirical assumption. Tell us a little bit about the kind of empirical difference that voter ID laws or other kinds of voter suppression attempts or changes to voting rules actually have in the American polity.
Right. Yeah. Let me just first say that our paper together, me and Justin Grimmer, is very expansive. So it also deals with very similar claims that the right makes about something like mail voting. How, Donald Trump says mail voting is going to help Democrats, and Democrats say, no, it's not. And there's big fights about this stuff. And all these laws have a very similar flavor, that they are not actually going to have noticeable impacts on who wins and who loses. So the logic with voter ID is maybe most straightforward. It is true that racial minorities are less likely to have a photo ID in places where we've studied this. I did a lot of work with this in Texas. But it's also true that very, very few people don't have IDs. So, it's something like, 4% or something like that of people maybe don't have an ID. And it is disproportionately true among racial minorities. But if you're worried about the law affecting outcomes, you can't stop there. You have to understand how many people without IDs are not going to vote because of that. And one thing we learn is that...
And presumably the kinds of people who don't have an ID are also likely to be the poorest and least civically engaged people. So sort of non-voters are already going to be overrepresented among that group, I would guess.
Correct. There's a huge... right. The people who don't have IDs, I mean, they don't have jobs. They are sort of at the fringes of civic life, and so they have very low turnout rates. Of course, I'm not making a normative judgment about whether that's good or bad. I'm just saying that the law is not going to turn away a huge number of the people who don't have IDs because they weren't going to vote. Also, obviously, some people will, like you said, like get an ID on account of the law, so they won't be denied the right to vote because of the law. But maybe the most important nuance of our paper is that the people who are actually affected by the law are actually quite balanced between Democrats and Republicans. And this comes from, I think, a sense of confusion that if you say some law, say, disproportionately affects African Americans, you then make an incorrect conclusion that therefore it hurts the party that most African Americans support, which is the Democrats. That's not true necessarily. And the reason it's not true is that a law can disproportionately negatively impact, say, African Americans, but it mostly affects white people, right? So like if 12% of the country or a state is black and 18% of the people who don't have IDs are black, then you would say it disproportionately affects African Americans, but still like the vast majority of the people it affects are not black. And
one example, one context in which this comes up is that it is true that African American children are much more likely proportionally to live in poverty than white children in the United States. That's obviously a huge disparity that has deep historic sources and is deeply unjust and unfair. It is not true that most children who live in poverty in the United States are black, just because the white population continues to be, about 4 times as big as the African American population. Most of the children living in poverty in this country are white. And so, this is, I think, one context in which a similar statistical shortcut leads people astray.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest one in voting rights is actually about felon disenfranchisement, where in every single state, African Americans are disproportionately disenfranchised on account of felon disenfranchisement laws. And there's a couple states where they're not. No one's disenfranchised. But across the country, most people who are disenfranchised by these laws are white. And the white, non-college educated men who are this largest group of people who are disenfranchised tend to be very Republican. And that's sort of the case of the voter ID law, too. The voter ID law is going to disproportionately negatively affect racial minorities. And for that reason alone, it might be deemed illegal under certain interpretations of the Voting Rights Act. But it still might be the case that the most people who don't have an ID are like low socioeconomic status white voters, and they are very Republican. And so what you have, the features that you have for a lot of these laws that are subject to a lot of debate around voter suppression is like the law doesn't affect that many people. Of that small number of people who it might affect, it only affects the turnout rates of a small number of those. And of those, there's roughly balance between Democrats and Republicans. And in part, that's because we're living in a different time than we did 50 years ago, where low socioeconomic status people who might be most sensitive to these changes in election laws are both disproportionately minority and mostly Republicans.
I mean, the other element here, and we're going a little bit beyond this immediate example, is something where I just find that the more highly educated people are, and sometimes the more they know about politics, the more fundamentally wrong they get the politics of ethnic minorities in the United States. And I think part of that is down to an availability bias. So, when people who went to good colleges, who tend to be the most influential people in the country, think about the views of ethnic minorities, they know people from those groups relatively well, right? If you went to any of the elite colleges in the United States in the last 25 years, you are likely to have friends and acquaintances, people who you know quite intimately from various minority backgrounds in the United States. And so when you think about, well, what are the views of African Americans? What are the views of Latinos? What are the views of this or that demographic? You naturally base it in some way on the people in your life that you know, and perhaps your colleagues at work now, and so on, right? But because these milieux themselves have become so deeply unrepresentative of the political views of a country as a whole, because the average black person at Harvard, but also the average white person at Harvard, also the average Latino person at Harvard, is way to the left of where the country as a whole is, I think these elite white people then just systematically get wrong what the politics of these other groups are. And so when people sort of angrily reject the politics of people, like Coleman Hughes or Thomas Chatterton Williams and so on, saying, like, you don't speak for black people in any kind of way, and there's this anger to that rejection, I think it's based in part on ideological interest, but it's in part based on, none of the people from that group that I know think like you, because on the whole they don't, because they're all, Harvard graduates, and most Harvard graduates don't hold those same views. And more broadly, it feels to me that is now leading astray the political campaign strategies of Democrats again and again, right? So there's a sort of similar shortcut to the one that you are describing with voter ID laws, right? Where in that case, they're saying, look, this is disproportionately disenfranchising black people. Black people tend to vote for Democrats, so therefore this is going to harm us. And for all the reasons you pointed out, that's too easy a shortcut, right? In the same way, I think people are saying, look, young people don't vote as much as older people. And African Americans are more left-leaning or more Democrat-leaning than white voters. And so if we want to win the election, we have to mobilize our base. And our base is non-white voters. And non-white voters are super to the left. And so the way to mobilize them and get them to the polls and win the election is for the party to move to the left. But that is wrong for a number of deep reasons, the most important of which is that particularly the Latino and African American voters who don't always turn out, who are not already in the vote bank for you, are the ones who are much more likely to be politically moderate or conservative and feel quite alienated from the party. That's why they're not showing up to vote in part, right? So I guess, how do you think all of this? Do you think all of this has implications for vote strategy in that kind of way? Are people making similar kinds of mistakes there, or am I taking this idea and running too far with it?
I mean, look, I guess I would put it more in the camp of like the liberal bubble that affects both higher ed and media, that leads people to just draw incorrect conclusions. I mean, it's really stunning how few people that you interact with on a daily basis, like, actually want to hear the different sides of different stories and understand why people disagree with them. That's just not the norm. And I find it like fascinating that I could teach a class where something like Citizens United comes up. Okay, in my election course, I do a couple lectures on Citizens United, and most of the students who come from these highly engaged, well-to-do families, whatever, they actually know. They've heard of Citizens United. This is like the landmark Supreme Court case around money in politics, and they know because they're on the left that they are opposed to the Citizens United decision. And then, lo and behold, you read it, the decision, and you discuss it, the various nuances, why people disagree, why the Supreme Court justices disagree, what's at stake. And every student's like, oh man, I never knew it was so complicated. I never knew that I have mixed feelings about it. Now, I just think that at every issue, when you talk to the typical, say, political hobbyist, say, who just reads the New York Times or whatever and is in their media bubble, it's not just focused on race issues. It's on any issue. That's why I brought up Citizens United. It's not a race issue. It's just an issue where there's just a tremendous lack of nuance, to the point where it's actually it's unbelievably easy to burst someone's bubble and make them realize that the issue's more complicated than they thought.
One concept I really like is called the ideological Turing test. So, the Turing test, as many listeners will know, is whether a machine can effectively pass itself off as human. And one of the interesting and scary things about some of the new forms of AI is that we're getting better and better at doing that. The ideological Turing test is asking, if you're a liberal, are you able to put forward a conservative argument in such a way that a conservative will say, yes, that is the argument that our side is making on this? If you're conservative, are you able to make a liberal argument in such a way that somebody's liberal is saying, like, yes, that is why we believe what we believe, that's why we hold these positions. And I think it's striking how bad Americans in general are at passing the ideological Turing test. And I would love for someone to go and run this study, but my hunch is that often the most highly informed and educated Americans might be less good at passing the ideological Turing test. Because I think that
100%. If you just know, like, you know, a lot of people probably who like obsessively read the New York Times, none of them can pass it. Like, I don't think anyone could. If you got your news exclusive to the New York Times, I don't think it would be possible to do what you're saying, to say a conservative position, an honest conservative position on most issues of the day. The only people who are able to do this have a much more curated news diet that forces themselves into that position.
yes, there may be some people who are really living and breathing politics who force themselves to, if they're liberal, to also read National Review, and if they're right-leaning, to also read, the New York Times or whatever, right? And I think often in more working class environment, there's less political homogeneity. People talk more loosely, actually. And so therefore people might get more of a sense of, oh, I have a buddy at work and he always goes on about this and I can kind of repeat to you what he's saying. And so actually Americans sort of lower down the scale of prestige and education may well be better at passing the ideological Turing test.
Yeah, I can believe that. I'd like to test it, but I believe it.
Well, go out and test it. I'm giving you this paper idea. You have done some work on college campus to try and both increase the understanding of the mostly left-leaning students you have at Tufts University of conservative ideas, and more broadly of encouraging civil discourse. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing on that front, and whether that's made you, more or less hopeful about the future of American higher education and our society more broadly.
Great question. Thank you. Yeah. So a couple years ago, I started developing this course curriculum on American conservatism. And what it has that I hadn't found in other places is a focus on public policy, contemporary public policy, bringing in conservative perspectives, right? So it's not like a history of political thought. It's not a history of the conservative movement and the Republican Party. It has some of this stuff because you need some baseline. But the main focus of the course is topics: family policy, religion in public life, welfare state, capitalism, affirmative action, guns, etc. And we basically are studying conservative perspectives and social science that conservatives tend to bring in to talk about these issues. I made the class on purpose not a class that's like a debate class where I bring in side A and side B, mostly because I wanted to cover a lot of ground, and I wanted the students who are overwhelmingly liberal on an overwhelmingly liberal campus, on which there are lots of courses that essentially articulate a homogenous left position. I wanted them to really get a flavor of a conservative identity, tensions in that identity, where the economic liberals differ from the social conservatives and so forth. But that's a class, and it's been the best teaching thing I've ever done. It's a very popular class. I think I'll have 100 students packed into a room next semester on it. And it does give me hope, because it's like a bubble inside a bubble. It's obviously self-selecting for students across the ideological spectrum. By the way, I think it's probably the most ideologically diverse room on campus, at least one that's talking about politics. It's possible that the engineering classes are actually more ideologically diverse, but it goes really well. The students want to learn about this stuff. It's stuff that they've never encountered before. They've never thought about family and children and divorce and religion in any of these ways that we're talking about in class. And it's a delight. It's a delight. And so, yeah, I think we need a lot more of it.
What do you think attracts students to that class? My understanding is that your other lecture classes were popular as well, so part of this may just be your reputation on campus. I assume you must attract some cohort of conservative students who are like, this is the one place on campus where there's a course that sort of speaks to me. Beyond that, what do you think draws in students who are either just intellectually curious and open-minded, or who are perhaps very devoted progressives and left-wingers to say, I actually want to engage with these conservative ideas, to have a sense of sort of, what makes those 100 kids choose the class when there's obviously many kids who, might choose the class who don't.
I do think that the focus on contemporary politics and policy does attract students in a way that, a class on, Edmund Burke wouldn't. Because there is a certain feeling in the class that we're talking about illicit things. And I don't think that feeling comes from like me trying to talk about it that way. It's just that like there's a class on conservative views on gay marriage or on the like trans rights, and the students like this stuff is juicy stuff, and the students just never get to talk about it. I mean, I was asked to give maybe a year or 2 years ago an evening lecture to the Tufts Republican Club about family values. That's what they want to talk about. And it was a big event. There were a lot of students there. And towards the end of the event, there was a bunch of students who had not sort of raised their hands and participated. And I asked them, I said, did you guys want to say anything? And the students said, we're not really part of this club. We just wanted to come and hear what it was about. And they were shocked that there was just sort of like an open conversation on campus about what people want from marriages and from raising children, and how can government help or how can government hurt. And it was just sort of shocking to see in real, like, to really see students say like, we're not talking about all these important things. And so I think a big driver of the class is like, we're just having an open, productive, nice conversation about like juicy topics that are like topical in the world, that are important to people, and that are just sort of like absent from other domains on campus.
Brandon, are you unmuted for some reason? Or there's no, I think it's when Eitan comes on and off the mic. Like, most of it is fine, and then towards the end, it sounds like there's like a line breathing into your ear or something bizarre. Brandon, are you hearing the same?
On my end?
Yeah, because the moment you mute yourself, it's gone. I think now is gone as well, but that's like a kind of like breathy, like it's weird.
So
you don't have a dog sleeping like very close to your microphone
no,
or something.
it's really like silent where I am.
Weird. I mean, there's only a few seconds at the end, so hopefully we'll be able to fix that, or worst case scenario, we somehow cut a couple sentences. But
I'm also recording it on my end, so I can share that.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, we can send that as well. Now it seems fine again. We'll just be vigilant about it. So I sort of go back and forth in how optimistic or pessimistic I am about the state of life on campus for undergraduates, by which I mean that certainly one of the things that I loved in my undergraduate experience was a sense of exploration of ideas, was a sense that, I had friends with whom I could debate the world in a way that wasn't devil's advocate, for perhaps sometimes we play devil's advocate in certain kind of contexts, but it wasn't sort of, oh, we just love to debate. It wasn't a debate me bro, right? The kind of pejorative characterization of that you sometimes see on social media. It was, people 18, 19, 20 thinking about the big ideas about the world, unsure what exactly they think about it, trying on different positions in a way that felt both playful and free in that moment, but that was morally earnest. I mean, it was an attempt to try and figure out how you should think about the world. And I'm really worried and saddened about the fact that when I gingerly ask my students whether they have some equivalent of that today, most of them say no. They say there's, many things that you would only discuss behind closed doors with your best friend if you happen to have somebody who you feel is somewhat open to that kind of thing, or perhaps somewhat politically aligned. You would not debate many issues in the dining hall. On the other hand, I found that when you try to create a space for that in the classroom, it's not that hard to do. There sometimes can go over rails, or there can be a few students who clearly are just censorious and you don't want to allow that conversation when you can see the other students getting scared. But on the whole, I think it succeeds. And I don't think that I'm sort of exceptional teacher or something like that. I don't think it's because I somehow am single-handedly able to overcome these kind of obstacles. And that makes me a little bit more optimistic that
Yeah.
perhaps we're over-indexing on those fears. How do you, so do you share the background concern I have, and sort of how bad do you think things are at the universities that you've observed?
So let me say that I think there are two kinds of polarization happening, neither of which are good. One is by campus. So I think that if you go down to big state schools anywhere, I was not that long ago gave a talk at Florida State. That's a good example, where it's like a huge school. It has everyone. It has the smartest kids. It has kids who are from every walk of life. And when you get into a political science class, you can expect that a bunch of kids there have a different view from you about abortion or gay rights or Israel Palestine, whatever. That's just because that's like that society, and it's represented in those classrooms. And I think that there's increasingly a polarization where on campuses like the one I teach on, and maybe one that you teach on, I don't know, of less than that. It just doesn't look like a microcosm of American society, and many views are not represented. I mean, I think that one reason the Israel Palestine stuff was so hard this year on campuses is because on most issues, like the big social issues, the students expect that everyone agrees with them on campus. That there is no one here who's, basically no one who's super pro-choice or pro-life, or no one who's here is anti-gay marriage. And then they found this topic this year on which there are really passionate positions on both sides, and they kind of lost their minds over it.
And including by way of university administration, which came into the habit over the last 10 years of opining about all kinds of political events in the world, and the assumption that 90% of recipients of his email are going to agree strongly, and the other 10% are going to know to shut up.
Right.
And suddenly you have an issue that's 50-50 on campus, or whatever
Right.
it is exactly on various campuses. And you don't have the sort of background preference cascades and preference falsification mechanisms that make the ones who disagree shut up. And then people are really upset about the email from the university. And so I think one of the good things that have come out of this, Harvard just announced this, and a bunch of other universities, and I've been arguing this for a good number of months, as have many others, is that some of these universities are now remembering the wisdom of the Chicago principles and saying perhaps we shouldn't have these institutional statements taking positions on 90-10 issues either, because then we're going to have to issue them on 50-50 issues, and then we're going to get screwed in situations like this one.
Right. At the same time, I do think we have this major brand differentiation happening where tends to be bigger state schools in red or purple states that are saying we want to make sure the culture of our campus is welcome to conservatives and liberals, to healthy debate. And so we're going to invest money in building programs for that. And there are going to be other schools that kind of double down on a very kind of homogenous leftist position in the culture that they're trying to curate. And that's going to be a brand differentiation that affects where students go, where donors go, and so forth. So that's interesting. There's another form of polarization which happens.
But very brief. I know I keep interrupting you, but it's because you keep triggering interesting thoughts in my mind. In general, I think brand differentiation is good. I'm always struck by how little brand differentiation there is in higher education. How similar so many different institutions are. In the courses they offer, in the ideological outlook they have, but also just in sort of all of the things that you buy with tuition that you have to opt into and so on. So I think in general, we need way more differentiation in American higher ed. The problem is that the most prestigious schools still are moving in the same direction, right? And so it's still going to be the case that the places that produce the largest share of the American elite don't seem to be going in different directions. I wish that there was something where, Brown goes off and becomes, ideologically super progressive, and Harvard is somewhere in the middle, and UPenn goes all the way in the other direction, and you just have a bunch of these super elite schools that also have very different models. I think that could be a positive thing, but instead you have this like weird segmentation where the super elite schools all go in one direction, and the big state schools go in another direction, and I'm not sure that is as healthy for society.
Yeah, I agree. But it kind of look. It takes things can move with entrepreneurial people doing stuff. I mean, I have in mind now to start maybe building beyond just the class that I teach, a broader center that focuses on some of these social problems, healthy relationships, and conservative perspectives on the role of government at a place like Tufts, which is a very, sort of like branded as a social justice place. But if I can find supporters to work with me on building that, then maybe we can just sort of differentiate and offer that as a home base for people who are looking for that. So if any of your listeners have a few $1,000,000 they want to invest in, a conservative center, let me know. But the other form of polarization I think is important to point out happens internal to schools, where if you just think of sort of like where politics is taught in the classroom, of course, it's taught in our political science departments, and it's also taught in different ways in, say, humanities departments, where there might be like a humanities, anthropology, sociology, race, colonial, diaspora studies department that is teaching about, say, American politics, but from a very different lens with different methodologies than in political science. And that might lead to this separation of students with different worldviews taking these different kinds of classes. And, there are humanities classes where the goal is not debate, the goal or like understanding different views. It's sort of like just empathizing with the view expressed by the teacher through the readings. It's a really different model than in the social sciences that we're used to, which does have, I think, an element of like, why should I believe that? How do you know? Kind of mentality. And so I think about this related to my class, because people always ask me why does the class go so well? I mean, how can you possibly be talking about these hot button racial, sexual identity issues, etc.? Well, the answer is mostly probably because it's self-selective. It's probably, again, not because I'm the brilliant teacher, but I get the smartest students. I mean, I really think that this is sort of my secret way to fill a classroom with like super bright students. You offer a class on conservatives, and what you're going to get is like a cross section of the students who really want to learn something different than they're getting elsewhere, and it generates an amazing classroom environment. But that means, though, that like there's a lot of people who are not selecting into that as well.
Slightly random question. What do you think makes for a good teacher? I am sometimes surprised by which people who are thoughtful and charismatic seem to struggle to teach, and which people who aren't necessarily the most kind of charismatic people tend to attract a real following on campus and are able to really build out these kind of programs. I think sometimes it helps to be a kind of cult leader in ways that makes me a little bit nervous. You see a certain kind of professor who has a big following on campus. It's because they're a little bit bullshit artists, and they require a certain kind of allegiance, a certain kind of unthinking applause for them that actually can play quite well with 18, 19-year-olds for various reasons. But there's others who are not like that at all, who do genuine intellectual work, who don't require their students to sort of applaud everything they say, who do serious intellectual work, and they're able to attract a good number of students. It sounds to me like you fall into that category. So what do you think are some of the virtues that popular professors have who are not pandering, who are not just giving everybody an A, who are not weird political cult leaders?
Yeah, so definitely, I think giving everyone an A is probably the easiest ticket to to being a popular professor. That's not my approach. And you're right. I mean, I think there are a lot of different ways to do this. I mean, there are some people who are just so smart and wise in their teaching that students don't care what their teaching style is, basically. But I mean, for me, I think it does relate to research in a way that's important to note, which is that the fact that I do a lot of research on these topics and I can bring that into the classroom does signal to students that I really know my way around some of these issues. And the same skill set in research or in writing of just being very organized, of like having a good outline and knowing where the beginning, middle, and end of a lecture is also seems to be undervalued. Like, just like having a tight argument that you are trying to get across or a set of hypotheses that you want to explore goes a long way. I would say also, like, I do something that is a bit rare on campus, which is like I have a very strict no technology policy. I also don't ever use PowerPoints myself. I like write on the board. I expect students to be fully cognitively present, no computers or laptops. No, I don't even like when if they have those iWatches where they're doing that. And I try to create a space that is different from the rest of their life. Like if we're gonna like talk together for an hour and a half on these topics, like I want them to be plugged in. And I just like I can't believe actually how many professors just are okay with their students like just going on texting or whatever. And it's funny, I bring this up in the beginning of the conservatism class because it actually is very much tied to a conservative moral worldview that versus a liberal worldview. The liberal worldview is like, look, who am I to judge these students? Maybe they are texting their mom about something, a family health emergency. It's not my position to help them. And my position is like, no, we all, none of us have the self-control that we wish we had to pay attention. We need rules, cultural constraints to help us be our best selves. And so in my class, there's no computers, and in most classes, there are computers everywhere.
To end this conversation, let me go back to the beginning. I've been wondering through this conversation whether I'm a political hobbyist. I think I may be. I think a lot of people listening to this podcast may at least have traits of political hobbyists. How can we do better? What in our behavior should we eye skeptically, and how can we avoid the pitfalls of political hobbyism in ourselves?
Yeah, so I mean, if one is to read the book that I wrote about political hobbyism, I think they'll see that I profile about, I don't know, 6 or 8 activists who I think are doing politics in a productive way. And a lot of those people are doing like very simple things, organizing their old age home so that people vote, helping organize families in the school to help their students in a not so good public school system. And I don't think everyone has it in them to be that person, the local civic hero. But I would like more people to read those stories and understand that that's sort of like the form of politics they should hold dear to them. That is like, we probably will learn more lessons about politics and be better people if we thought about the person who's on our condo board or on the social action or ritual committee of their church, or who's on the school board and understands like what are their constraints, how do they do their work, how can we learn more about how they operate. Those people I think will feel more real and will give us lessons for how we can all behave better than like if we just read op-ed pages that lament what's going on in national politics. So I think like it's reorienting ourselves to what political activity can look like and what inspiring political activity can look like at a state and local level is a good first step in my view.
Stop being on social media, stop reading political news, but do subscribe to Persuasion. Eitan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Nice talking to you.